here from the Milndavie Pottery in Strathblane, Scotland. Most of the glazes that we use are from the Amico Potter's Choice range. When you're deciding on which glaze you want to use, it's important to choose not only by colour but also by what the glaze does when it's painted onto texture. So here, for example, is blue rutile, and you can see on the saucer here, when it's on a flat surface, you see a lot of the blue, a little bit of the brown. But when it's on a textured surface, it actually swaps over and you see a lot of the brown, and the blue kind of sinks into dents. It's actually a really lovely look. And when you put blue rutile onto very fine texture, you see a little bit of the blue, but the thing that is really lovely is that you don't lose the texture. The little fine detail on blue rutile looks really nice. The same is true of textured turquoise, and in fact with textured turquoise it looks like you've put two colours on when actually all you've done is put one colour, but where there's texture the colour has broken. That's the official potter's term, it's broken on the texture. And so where the dents are deeper, you've got that lovely kind of aquamarine blue, and you've got the more greeny on the bits that are higher. So you can see here on the smoothest, smooth saucer, where it wasn't smooth, little bits of the bluey colour show, but mostly you see the green. And interestingly, on the fine detail, you don't really get much blue at all with textured turquoise, but what you do get is that you can see the fine detail. Now, in contrast, have a look at seaweed. Now, seaweed on the saucer, on the flat, it's a beautiful colour. It doesn't really do much about the texture. And similarly, when you get it onto some texture, of course you can still see the lines, but it's self-levelled to quite an extent and you don't really see the detail. And when you get to the fine detail of this tile, if I can just try and get that in a way that you could see it, well, the reason you can't see very much at all is that even though the pattern on this is the same as on that other little tile, but the glaze has kind of filled in the gaps and you don't see much at all. So seaweed is brilliant for colour, but not very good for texture, whereas textured turquoise and blue rutile, they do really well with texture. And we've got plenty of others that are good examples of working well with texture, but I wanted to use these as an example so that you can understand why we have 3 samples for each colour and why you need to look at what you've made and think about not only what colour would you like it to be, but have you put texture onto what you made and what will happen to the glaze around the texture. So these two are very interesting. Oatmeal makes this lovely kind of mottled effect. It doesn't really show up the texture very well, but the kind of mottled oatmeal-y colour is fantastic. You see here, you just about can't see any of the texture that was on this tile, but nevertheless the colour is lovely. And Ancient Jasper is fantastic what it does on flat things. Look at that. It kind of pulls into these red it's colours. Much better on the flat. It doesn't really do that on edges of things. You see on this bowl, it's there a little bit on the edges, but where it's really made that is at the bottom of the bowl. You can see a bit of the texture, but its main wonder is this colour that it makes. You see on the fine texture, you can see the texture, but it's not so brilliant with texture. Much more brilliant where things are flat on the kiln shelf so that the glaze can settle. It's all to do with gravity with Ancient Jasper. So here are 2 of my favourites, Iron Lustre and Tourmaline. So iron lustre is particularly great with texture. You can see all of the colours on that bowl. Even on the flat thing, you can see wherever there's a dent, it's done something. And on the fine texture, I really hope the camera can get that, because you can really see those lovely shapes and indents. Now, tourmaline is not so great on the texture. That's got the same pattern on it as the iron lustre tile, but you can hardly see. You can a little bit, but not really. But the thing about tourmaline is that the colour is so nice that it doesn't really matter unless you want something that is really going to highlight your texture. The colour of it is just delicious. So here we have Blue Midnight and Vert Lustre. So I find with both of these that in the wrong context they can be a bit boring. So the Blue Midnight, it's not brilliant on texture. And what I find is that if you have quite a decent surface area, the blue actually comes out really nicely. But if you put it onto a smaller surface area, it just ends up looking a bit too dark, a bit too black-like, really. So, or navy maybe. So I'm always a bit nervous about Blue Midnight. I've seen it looking brilliant on things, but not always. And it's a bit similar with Vert Lustre, that on texture actually this is, it does some fascinating things. But I kind of find as a green that it's a bit of a dull green, really. Although on the texture, it does do interesting things on the fine texture. So I do use Vert Lustre sometimes. So here we have Deep Fire Brick and Smoky Merlot. Now I think they've named that colour, Deep Fire Brick. I think they've named it really well, because that is exactly the colour of those kind of old-fashioned bricks around a fireplace. You can see that it doesn't really do much for the texture. You can just about see the texture on that tile, but not very well. And on this bowl you can see the texture a bit, but it does kind of self-level, really. So what I find is that it's a bit of a boring colour on a large piece, but I've used it really successfully for things like the berries on a plate with holly on it, and so you just have to think about how to use fire brick. Smoky Merlot, on the other hand, there's something a bit more satisfying about the colour if you really like that kind of purpley plum sort of colour, and you can see that it does something nice with the texture and has a sort of slightly orange bit that happens. There it is on the flat, and with the intricate texture, it covers it over, really. You can see it a bit, but not very much. So with Smoky Merlot, I think it's much more about the colour, really, rather than the texture. So here we have Matcha Matte and Palladium, and they're both quite unusual glazes. This Matcha Matte it does have a sheen on it, but it's not as shiny as some of our glazes. You can see that it does something interesting with texture, and even on the smooth saucer, it has more than one colour that it ends up with, and you can see what it does with the texture here. So it's kind of a dull colour, but in a very earthy, interesting way. I really like that glaze. And very contrastingly, Palladium is a shiny, shiny metallic. It's our only metallic glaze at the moment, and it's really shiny. So it's got a much higher shine, really, probably than any of our other high fire glazes. So on the texture, it doesn't really show up the texture, except that it's so shiny that it catches the light in where the texture is, and that's how it shows it up. So on the intricate tile, it's kind of self-leveled, but because of the shine, you can still see the intricate pattern. So they're two extremely different glazes, those two. Here we have deep Sienna Speckle and frosted melon. So the Sienna is a really nice kind of orangey colour. It shows up the texture a little bit, not huge contrast, but you can definitely see the texture there. And on the kind of deeper texture, you can definitely see it. It doesn't so much change colour, but somehow you can see the texture. The melon, on the other hand, you don't so much see the texture. But the thing that's such fun about the melon is that it kind of does that dark thing round the edges exactly as a melon does. When you look at melon, when you've cut it open, it does that dark thing round the edges. So I think that's really fun. And then you'll see, you can see the texture there, but it doesn't show it up really well. It doesn't cover it too much, but it doesn't show it up either. So they're nice colours next to each other. You could put them on the same piece. I don't know what would happen if you layered them. We've never done that, but to literally put them next door to each other on a piece would be okay, except where they meet in the middle. I'm not sure what would happen. Here's an example where I use melon alongside another colour, which actually is Sandstorm, but melon is, because it's a lighter colour, it's quite a nice contrast if you pick your companion colour well. I didn't layer, I just painted the different parts in different colours. These two are really nice glazes. There's the deep olive speckle and the Albany slip brown. The thing about the deep olive speckle is that it's got this kind of fleck in it that's quite kind of dark, and I suppose that's the speckle, which makes it look really nice. Not sure if how green it is shows up on the camera. I hope it is, because it's really quite an olive green. You can see that the texture shows up, and particularly on the fine texture, it really does show up nicely. So if you've got something with very fine texture, then this is a lovely colour to use. So alternatively, the Albany slip brown, it really ruins your texture. You can't see hardly any of that same pattern, but it does this fantastic thing where it ends up looking like two different colours. This lovely, where it's run deeper, this kind of honey colour, and then the orangey brown that it has. And that's you know, if you like orange, I know they call it brown, but I think it's a bit more orange than brown, but kind of, you know, honey orange. It's a really nice colour. So both of these are super colours. So almost all of our glazes are made by Amico, but we just currently stock 3 from a company called Duncan, and that's just because we really liked these glazes. So we've got Sandstorm, Lagoon and Buttermilk from Duncan. So Sandstorm is kind of orange, but where the texture is, it ends up a bit purpley, and it does show up the texture nicely on there. It's not so great on fine texture. You see that, you can see it, but it doesn't show up really well. But it's just a nice colour. And Lagoon similarly, there are Amico colours that are similar, but this kind of brown, green, blue is just a very nice glaze colour. And this one, it does show up the fine texture, not brilliantly, but it does interesting things. And then my favourite, not that I've got favourites of course, but this is my favourite, Buttermilk, which if it pulls, it can look a little bit too thick, but I just really like the colour. You know, it suits me, this colour. That's what it looks like on the flat. But the thing that I like about Buttermilk is that you get unpredictable results. You know, you can't see the fine texture at all on this, but look at what it's done with all those purples and all sorts of colours. And the thing with Buttermilk is that you can't always be sure what it's going to do. You know, sometimes it will be this kind of honey, a bit too thick, lovely look. Sometimes you'll get the purples. Sometimes you'll just get that kind of slightly darker around the edges, but it just, for me, is a lovely glaze. When I can't decide what to glaze with, I always pick buttermilk.